Welcome to the Supply Chain Dialogues, Season 4, Episode 7. I'm Daniel Helmig, and we're near the end with this second-to-last episode of the series. We've explored why measurement standards correlate negatively with emission reduction. We've discovered that cost-benefit analysis systematically kills climate investments. We've seen how regulation focus on Scope 1 and 2 barely touch the Scope 3 elephant in the room. We examined why digital transformation alone doesn't deliver decarbonisation, and we've dealt with the organizational paradox, why larger companies with more resources actually struggle more than smaller companies. It's been a bit depressing. 6 episodes of here's why everything we're doing isn't really working. And if you do not believe me that it is not working and that we're not really cutting it, just listen to the coverage of the currently ongoing 30th COP, where all governments, or at least the grown-ups among them, meet to discuss again what would be good to do. You will read that we have already missed the 1.5 degrees target set at the Paris COP21, or take a look at Iceland, a country where most people seem to have their heads and hearts still in the right place. They defined this week that they regard the risk from melting glaciers and a potential linked collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which is called AMOC, as a national security threat. If you then read about what the collapse of the AMOC means, you will quickly find that it will create a new ice age in Europe. Not the cute one we know from the movies with the talking mammoth and the sloth. And if any US American now gleefully claps in their hand that these damn liberal Europeans get what they deserve, be advised that one of the several effects of the collapse is that a weakened AMOC would cause water to pile up along the US Atlantic coast, raising sea levels by 20 to 30 centimeters beyond global averages in cities like New York, Boston, and Miami. So ensure that in the next 10 years you still catch up with your visit to the MoMA, consider an alternative university to the MIT for your kids, and have one last overpriced vacation in Florida.
Okay, Daniel, enough of this doomsday talk. I know that you are using scientific facts, but scare scenarios will not get us anywhere. Getting back to what we've been talking about in the last 6 episodes, we've been systematically dismantling conventional wisdom about supply chain sustainability. But surely this episode is where we pivot to solutions?
Because it's not too late, even though it is quite an uphill battle now. But let's try. Today we're translating the research into positive action. We're answering the question, if current approaches are systematically failing, what actually works? And I want to be clear about something up front. This isn't about marginal improvement to broken systems. We're not tweaking standards here, adjusting economic models or refining regulations. Those approaches fundamentally miss the point. What we need is a paradigm shift. And I know that sounds like consultant speak, but I mean it literally. The current paradigm, measure more, analyze thoroughly, regulate comprehensively, is actively preventing the transition we need.
So what paradigm should replace it?
The transformation paradigm. Instead of asking how do we measure emissions better, we ask how do we how do we reduce emissions faster? Instead of how do we conduct more rigorous cost-benefit analysis, we ask how do we restructure evaluation frameworks to enable climate action? It's a fundamental shift from compliance to transformation, from measurement to action, from analysis to implementation. And that does not mean, as the government heads of the current COPs are shouting in all directions, that we just need another climate fund. This has been tried so many times that it becomes boring.
And the research you did provides evidence for this paradigm shift.
The research proves that the current paradigm isn't working. All 3 core hypotheses showed systematic barriers. Standards implementation correlates negatively with progress, economic assessment kills climate investment, and regulatory frameworks fail to incentivize meaningful change. But the research also revealed what does work. We discussed it in the other episodes. Companies with geographic diversity perform better, organizations that focus on implementation costs rather than comprehensive economic evaluations make more progress, and firms that prioritize operational changes over compliance theater get results done. So today, we're building on those insights to provide concrete recommendations for three audiences: academics, policymakers, and business leaders.
Let's start with academics, since this research emerged from doctoral work. What should the academic community focus on?
Academics need to rethink how we conceptualize and study supply chain sustainability fundamentally. The current literature is trapped in its own assumptions, which are leading us astray. First, we need longitudinal studies. My research was cross-sectional, a snapshot at one point in time. But transformation is a process. We need to understand how companies evolve their approaches, what triggers successful transition, and how implementation strategies change over time. One company reducing emissions by 20% in year one might achieve that through easy wins, switching to renewable energy and optimizing logistics. But years 2 through 5, when they're tackling complex supplier relationships and product redesign, that's where the real learning happens, and we're not studying it so far.
What other methodological changes do academics need to make?
We need mixed method approaches. Quantitative research like mine can identify relationships and measure effect sizes, but it can't tell you why those relationships exist or how organizations navigate the barriers we're identifying. Imagine pairing a study like mine with an in-depth case research. The quantitative work shows that larger companies struggle more with implementation. The qualitative work might reveal that the struggle stems from siloed decision-making, diffuse accountability, and misaligned incentives. I talk about this, but this is something that we assume we would need a real mixed method approach to figure that out.
The research also highlighted the need to study alternative measurement frameworks.
The current measurement paradox, comprehensive, precise, and comparable, creates sustainability bureaucracy. We need research into action-oriented measurement frameworks that support implementation rather than just reporting. What would a measurement system look like if we were designing to accelerate transformation rather than enable comparison? How would we measure outcomes rather than processes? What metrics actually correlate with emissions reduction rather than just transparency? These are researchable questions that could fundamentally reshape how companies approach sustainability measurements.
And what about studying the organizational factors you've identified?
Yes, the organizational paradox, where larger companies with more resources struggle more than smaller firms, needs deeper investigation. We need research into how do different governance structures affect climate actions, what decision-making processes enable rapid implementation, how should organizations allocate resources to balance compliance with transformation, and what incentive systems actually drive emission reduction. Again, we have indications of that as well in the podcast, but it is based on our assumptions, not necessarily based on real, hard analysis. The sustainability literature has focused heavily on what companies should do: reduce emissions, engage suppliers, implement circular economic principles. We need much more research on how organizations can actually execute those strategies within their structural constraints.
What about geographic and cross-cultural research?
My research focused on German discrete manufacturing. The findings are robust within that context, but we don't know how they translate to other regions, other industries, or other cultural contexts. Does the standard paradox exist in Japan, where corporate culture emphasizes continuous improvement? Do Chinese manufacturers operating under different regulatory frameworks face the same economic assessment barriers? How do US companies with their shareholder primacy model navigate the triple bottom line differently from European firms? We kind of know, but we should really analyze this in detail. We need comparative studies across countries, industries, and regulatory environments, because if we're going to design effective policies and practices, they need to work across contexts, not just in one specific setting.
Any final recommendations for the academic community?
Academics need to engage more directly with practitioners. Too much sustainability research sits behind journal paywalls, is written in academic language, and addresses questions academics find interesting rather than those practitioners need answered. That's, for example, I decided to make my study open access. You can go into Google Scholar and search for my name, and you will find the PDF for easy consumption. We need action research, where academics partner with companies to implement and study transformation efforts in real time. We need research that informs practice and practice that informs research. The gap between academic knowledge and business implementation is one reason we're failing to make progress on net zero.
Good. Let's shift to policymakers. The research revealed significant gaps in current regulatory approaches. What should change?
Policymakers in Europe need to rethink the European Union's approach to emission reduction fundamentally. The current framework is systematically misaligned with the climate challenge we face. Let me start with the most important recommendation. Refocus regulation on Scope 3 emissions. The current approach, mandatory reduction targets for Scope 1 and 2, reporting requirements only for Scope 3, is a catastrophic misapplication of the Pareto principle. For most companies, again, I say it over and over again, 70 to 90% of their emissions fall under Scope 3. But that's where we have the weakest policy mechanisms. It's like a doctor prescribing intensive treatment for a minor symptom while ignoring the life-threatening condition.
The research showed regulatory frameworks had weak relationships with implementation. Why?
Because current regulations focus on compliance rather than transformation. They mandate processes, measurement, reporting, disclosure, rather than outcomes. Companies can tick every box, satisfy every requirement, and still not reduce emissions. Policymakers should mandate emission reduction, not reporting methodologies. Set clear targets. Reduce Scope 3 emissions 50% by 2035. Then let companies achieve those targets however they want. Stop prescribing specific measurement approaches, standardized frameworks, or compliance procedures. You don't get it anyhow.
Won't that create problems with comparability and transparency?
Possibly. But here's the question. Would you rather have perfect comparability of emissions that aren't actually declining, or messy but declining emissions that are harder to compare? The research reveals that the pursuit of measurement perfection is consuming resources that should be directed towards transformation. We're optimizing for the wrong outcome. And let's be honest, current reporting isn't as comparable as policymakers think. Different companies use different methodologies, make various assumptions, and apply different boundaries. The veneer of standardization masks substantial variation in practice.
What about economic barriers? Should policy address those?
Yes. The research showed that traditional cost-benefit analysis systematically undervalues sustainability investments. Policymakers can address this in several ways. First, implement meaningful carbon pricing. If carbon had a real price that reflected its environmental cost, suddenly those sustainability investments would look much more attractive in economic analysis. Second, provide transition funding and incentives. The EU spends billions on subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. If you do not believe me, listen to our episode in Season 3 on this topic. It's scary. Why not shift equivalent funding into supply chain transformation? Create dedicated funds that companies, especially those in process industries such as steel or chemicals, can access for supplier engagement, product redesign, or logistics transformation. And third and final, adjust regulatory requirements around financial reporting. Currently, companies must justify investments to shareholders using traditional financial metrics. What if regulations required companies to report on carbon intensity, resource efficiency, and circularity with the same rigor as financial performance? And there's something to be said about the gaps, the general accepted accounting principles, but this I will cover in my upcoming book.
The research also found that regulatory compliance activities compete with implementation efforts. How should policymakers address that?
Simplify, consolidate, rationalize. The EU has created a complex web of overlapping requirements: CSRD, EU taxonomy, carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and an upcoming supply chain due diligence directive. Each has individually some merits. Collectively, they're overwhelming. Policymakers should create a single, unified framework for sustainability reporting and regulations and a small one. One set of requirements, one reporting standard, one compliance process. Cut the bureaucracy dramatically. Here, I would actually use generative AI to sift through all the regulations on European and member state level to cut through the Gordian knot regulators have created. And focus that framework on outcomes, not processes. Don't require companies to describe their governance structures, stakeholder engagement processes, and risk assessment methodologies. Require them to report actual emissions, reduction trajectories, and implementation progress.
What about the geographic dimension? The research found that companies with broader international presence perform better.
The sweet spot is regulatory alignment on outcomes with flexibility on processes. All regions should mandate similar emission reduction targets and timelines. Wouldn't that be something meaningful for the next COP? But allow regional variation in how companies achieve those targets, reflecting different economic contexts, technological capabilities, and supply chain structures.
Any recommendations about regulatory timelines?
Yes. Stop pushing net zero targets to 2050 or 2045. The research examines whether 2040 was achievable with current approaches. The answer is no, not with current approaches, but that doesn't mean we should extend the timeline. It means we should change our way. Policymakers should set aggressive targets. Net zero scope 3 by 2035. And then restructure everything else to enable companies to achieve them. Aggressive targets create urgency. Urgency forces innovation. Innovation drives transformation. And extended timelines create complacency. We have 25 years becomes an excuse for inaction today. And as Daniel Kahneman pointed out, climate change, due to its long timeline, is the perfect storm for any human brain. We cannot compute these time horizons. So let's make them more tangible. Think about the AMOC, MoMA, and MIT.
Should policymakers address the organization paradox, where larger companies struggle more?
Interesting question. One could argue that's an internal company problem, not a policy concern. But larger companies represent a disproportionate share of emissions. If they're systematically constrained from action, that's a policy-relevant problem. Policymakers might consider size differentiation in regulatory approaches, not lower standards for larger companies. That would be perverse. But different compliance mechanisms that acknowledge organizational complexity. For example, smaller companies report annually using simplified frameworks. Fine. Larger companies might submit 5-year transformation plans with interim milestones and greater flexibility in how they demonstrate progress. The goal is to reduce the bureaucratic burden that amplifies barriers in large organizations whilst maintaining accountability for results.
Let's turn to business leaders. They're the ones who actually have to implement these changes. What should they do differently?
Now, business leaders need to rethink how they approach the supply chain sustainability fundamentally. And I'm going to be very direct here. If you're treating this as a compliance exercise, you're already lost. And for once, look into the faces of your children. We're airing that before Christmas, and probably they're all coming home if you have some kind of relationship with them. So look into their faces. If you are a corporate exec in a large company, you will be between end 40 to end 50. Your offspring, therefore, will be in their 20s to 30s. According to most scientists, the AMOC will collapse within the next 10 to 20 years. Do you want this world for your kids? And if the CO2 levels drive global temperatures up to 2.5 to 4 degrees, this will happen by the end of this century, which means your potential grandchildren will be in their 60s. Human society at that point in time in most areas will not be a great place to retire in. And forget Mars or the moon, the wet dream of Elon. This environment sucks even more. So the companies that will succeed in achieving net zero aren't those with the best sustainability reports or the most sophisticated carbon accounting. They are the companies that actually transform their supply chains to drive net zero in the largest pocket they are responsible for. And transformation requires different approaches than compliance, as we discussed in several episodes. So, here are a few recommendations. First, create dedicated transformation teams with absolute authority. Not a sustainability department that produces reports and advises operations. A transformation team that can make decisions, allocate resources, and drive changes across function. And that does not necessarily mean that they have to be outside. They can be representatives from the functional areas and the organizational areas that you have in your company, but these are the guys and ladies that have to be able to make decisions.
The research showed that organizational size amplifies barriers. How should large companies address that?
Large companies need to decentralize decision-making while centralizing coordination. Set clear emission reduction targets centrally, then push decision authority to business units, regions, and even individual facilities. The German team doesn't need headquarter approval to switch suppliers. The Chinese facility doesn't need a committee to approve logistics changes. Give clear boundaries. Stay within these parameters. Hit these targets. And then trust your people to find solutions. And create mechanisms for rapid knowledge sharing. What works in one region should be implementable elsewhere within months, not years. The research showed that geographic diversity is an advantage, but only if companies actually leverage their global footprint to share and scale innovations.
What about incentive systems? The research suggested those are misaligned.
Most companies have incentive systems that reward financial performance exclusively or overwhelmingly. And then they wonder why sustainability initiatives don't get traction. So modify incentive systems to make carbon metrics count. And I don't mean 5 to 10% of variable compensation. I mean 30 to 40%. Make carbon performance as important as financial performance in determining bonuses, promotions, and career advancement. And here's the secret. Your teams will still focus on revenue, profit, cost, etc., etc. Whether the bonus is focused 100% or 50%. Trust me. I've seen this before over and over again. You will be positively surprised what works. And don't just reward the sustainability team for emission reduction. Reward procurement for choosing low-carbon suppliers, operations for implementing efficient processes, product development for designing sustainable products, and logistics for optimizing transportation. Sustainability cannot be the job of one department. It has to be everyone's job, and people do what they are paid to do.
The research showed that traditional cost-benefit analysis kills climate investments. What should companies do about that?
Restructure your evaluation frameworks. Traditional cost-benefit analysis using conventional discount rates and traditional time horizons, ROIs, etc., systematically undervalues sustainability investments. Companies should develop extended business cases that include factors conventional analysis ignores. Here are a couple of examples. Internal carbon pricing that reflects true environmental cost. Regulatory risk scenarios that consider likely future policies, reputational value and brand enhancement, employee engagement and talent retention, supply chain resilience and optionality, and future carbon tax avoidance. Suddenly, that expensive sustainability supplier or the investment that you would have to take for scope 1 and 2 looks like the obvious choice when you factor in regulatory risk, carbon pricing, and supply chain resilience.
Should companies abandon cost-benefit analysis entirely?
No. Financial analysis matters. Companies need to be economically viable, but the evaluation frameworks need to evolve. Include longer time horizons, 10 or 15 years instead of 3 to 5. Use lower discount rates for sustainability investments, reflecting their different risk profiles. Monetize non-financial benefits where possible. Who said that you only have to work based on the financial governance system? See them as a minimum threshold and then go beyond it. And understand that you cannot do all the changes at once. You have to figure out a way together with your CFO to get that working. But always consider the alternatives. We talked about the faces of your children. And then create parallel evaluation frameworks as long as the policies and the regulations have not followed. Some investments compete in traditional financial markets. Expand this factory, launch that product. Sustainability investments operate differently. They are buying long-term survival, regulatory compliance, and societal license to operate. Evaluate them differently.
What about the standards paradox? Should companies reduce their focus on measurement and reporting?
Be strategic about compliance. Do only what is necessary to satisfy regulatory requirements, then direct resources to actual implementation. And here's the controversial recommendation. Consider strategic non-compliance with voluntary standards. If you're not legally required to report to CDP or adopt SBTi or achieve B Corp certification, think carefully about whether those frameworks help or hinder your transformation efforts and where to best put your people. Every hour spent on voluntary reporting is an hour not spent on emission reduction. Every pound spent on consultants perfecting your sustainability report is a pound not invested in supplier transformation. And please exchange it into euro or dollars as you see fit. Be ruthless, focus on impact over optics.
Won't that create problems with investors and stakeholders?
Possibly. But here's what you say. We're focusing on actually reducing emissions rather than perfecting our reporting. Our Scope 3 emissions are down 25% over the past 3 years. That matters more than whether we have adopted every voluntary framework. Shareholders want results. Some will care deeply about reporting standards, mainly those with no real-world experience, by the way. But increasingly, investors and customers are recognizing the difference between compliance theater and actual transformation. Position yourself on the side of transformation.
The research found that technology investments don't automatically deliver emissions reduction. What should companies do differently?
We talked about it. Avoid digital displacement. The tendency to substitute technology for operational transformation. Don't invest in carbon accounting software unless you're investing in the operational changes that reduce the carbon you're accounting for. And why I'm not getting paid by them in any way, I recommend CarbMe, CARBMEE, a great no-nonsense reporting company from Germany. Visit them in Berlin or Munich and be amazed. Use technology strategically to enable transformation, not replace it. Carbon tracking is valuable if it identifies opportunities and drives decisions. It's wasteful if it just produces dashboards that nobody acts on. And be especially wary of technology vendors promising easy solutions. There are no easy solutions, there are no easy fixes. Any vendor claiming their software will achieve net zero for you is selling digital snake oil.
What about supplier engagement? That came up repeatedly as critical for Scope 3 emissions.
Sure, supplier engagement is essential, but companies approach it backwards. They create supplier codes of conduct, require sustainability reporting, and send questionnaires. Then they wonder why nothing changes. Flip the model around. Partner with suppliers on transformation. Some companies are creating supplier transformation funds, dedicated capital that suppliers can access for sustainability investments. Others provide technical assistance, sharing expertise in energy efficiency, process optimization, or renewable energy procurement. The most sophisticated companies help suppliers find and implement solutions, then write those improved practices into supply contracts. It's collaborative transformation, not compliance enforcement. And yes, there will be always suppliers that need the approach, you must reduce emissions by X, otherwise we desource you. It is quite boring, intellectually not challenging, but if on the other side these are brutes that only listen to blunt threats, give them what they need. And by the way, try to find other suppliers.
Any recommendations about engaging smaller suppliers who lack resources?
Focus your efforts. You cannot deeply engage 1,000 suppliers, but you can deeply engage the 50 who represent 80% of your Scope 3 emissions. Work with them intensively. Fund their transformation. Share expertise. Then those 50 suppliers can engage their suppliers using similar approaches. Create a cascade model where transformation flows through tiers. It's slower than mandating change, but it actually works.
Let's address the elephant in the room. Can companies actually achieve net zero Scope 3 emissions by 2040 or even 2035?
Not with current approaches. The research proves that conclusively. Standards implementation, economic assessment, and regulatory frameworks are all negatively correlated with progress. But with transformed approaches, possible. Because what's the alternative? It's terrifying. Achieving net zero Scope 3 emissions isn't a project or program. It's a fundamental transformation of supply chain strategy, operations, governance, and cultures for our survival. Companies that treat it as less than that, as a compliance exercise, as a reporting challenge, or technological implementation will fail. The research proves it.
Is there hope?
There needs to be optimism. The research revealed systematic barriers, yes, but it also showed that those barriers are human constructs. We created these standards, these evaluation frameworks, and these regulatory approaches, which means we can change them. And some companies are already succeeding. They're the ones who abandon conventional wisdom and embrace transformation. They're achieving 20, 30, and even 40% reduction in Scope 3 emissions, not by perfecting their reporting, but by fundamentally changing their supply chains. The question isn't whether net zero is possible. The question is whether enough companies, policymakers, and academics will challenge conventional approaches and embrace transformation paradigms. Then net zero will happen, because the alternative is, as I said, gruesome.
Any final thoughts as we close this episode?
Yes. To everyone who's been with us through all 7 episodes, thank you. There haven't been comfortable conversations. We've challenged fundamental assumptions about how sustainability should work. But here's what I hope you can take away. If you're frustrated that your sustainability efforts aren't delivering the impact you're expecting, you're not wrong. The system is broken. The approaches that seemed logical and scientific, measure more, analyze carefully, regulate comprehensively, are actively preventing the transformation we need. But that's actually good news, because once you understand why current approaches fail, you can design strategies that succeed. And that's what the next generation of supply chain sustainability will look like. Transformation-focused, implementation-heavy, compliance-light, and ruthlessly focused on actual emissions reductions rather than perfect reporting. The climate doesn't care about our sustainability reports. It actually cares about nothing that we do. In reality, over the last 500 million years, temperature climbed to levels even higher than those we feel today. It resulted in massive changes in the ecosystems. Whole levels of fauna and flora went extinct. And then something else raised its head from the primordial morass and oceans and started again. For us, the only negative side of this is that this time it will be us, the human species, and most remaining mammals that will be wiped off the earth in large droves. As always, some pockets will survive, and the whole thing will start again. But is this really what we want? Are we so set in our ways that we see the slow-moving train wreck of our own demise in front of us, but are not able to operate the track switch to change our destiny? And if we are not able to change, it might be the right direction of humankind should go, after it already made so many other species extinct and polluted the earth. Maybe Charles Darwin would argue that we were not the fittest animal to survive and that we found the extinction condition that made us into fossils to be dug up in a couple of millennia or eons.
You do it again, Daniel. Let's stop this doomsday talk. Rather, tell us what comes next for Season 4.
We have one more episode planned. Episode 8 will bring everything together with a discussion of what all this means for the future of supply chain management and corporate sustainability. We'll talk about the skills leaders need, the organizational capabilities that will matter, and what successful companies will look like in 2035 when net zero is achieved, or not. Until then, remember, we're not measuring our way to net zero. We're not analyzing our way to net zero. We're not reporting our way to net zero. We're transforming our way there. And transformation requires fundamentally different approaches than what we've been using so far. Stay safe, be bold, and see you in 2 weeks. These are the Supply Chain Dialogues produced and copyrighted by Helmig Advisory in 2025.